Мы уже в эфире.
Добре. Welcome to all of you who are joining us today for this third in a series of discussions at the Ukrainian Free University on the war in Ukraine, its impact on Ukraine, Europe, and beyond. Today's session is what is the state of play on the battlefield and how might the war end? Because this series of lectures, this series of actually discussions is going to be taking place on a monthly basis, we are changing to a slightly more informal format in which our discussants, Professor Motyl and Professor Menon, will be opening the discussions, introducing the topics, and continuing into the discussion. In keeping with this new format, I am turning over the podium to Professor Motyl. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Prishak, for that kind introduction. And welcome to everybody. Welcome everybody to the Menon and Motyl seminar discussion half hour. We want to keep the conversation civil but interesting, focused on important themes, and of course, everything taking place in Ukraine and Russia today is important. So we obviously can't do justice to everything, but we can at least try to cover some of the most important topics as they occur. As you know, we'll be talking about two topics. We'll talk about the situation on the ground, on the battlefield, and then we'll move to possible scenarios for the war's end. So Raj, let me just start with the following. What's been manifestly clear in the last week and a half is that the Ukrainians are pressing on the right bank of Ukraine in the area of Kherson Oblast or Kherson province. So they're obviously making a play for that. At the same time, they've destroyed a number of bridges, or at least they've made them impassable. They haven't quite destroyed them, so that they're trying to focus on logistics. They continue to destroy ammunition dumps, fuel dumps, and things of that sort. But at the same time, the Russians are moving fairly significant numbers of forces from the Donbass to the area around Zaporizhzhia, and from the area around Zaporizhzhia across the Dnipro River into Kherson, the right bank of Kherson Oblast. And everybody's talking about a coming big battle, which may take place in a few days and may take place in a few weeks. What's your take on these movements? Because clearly something is afoot. What is afoot, and what can we expect will happen in the near term, in the medium to near term?
Well, thank you to Professor Prishak for organizing this and for all of you who are listening. Let me just start with something that Alex said in the beginning, that is about civility. We have been friends now for, I don't know, over 30 years. And through this, even in this very difficult period where we've had disagreements about this, that, or the other, we haven't allowed it to compromise in any way our friendship. And that's extraordinarily important, because I don't know, for those of you who are not in the United States, whether you understand how polarizing the debate has been, and sometimes even extremely ugly, so that people who try to explain why is Putin doing X, Y, and Z, which should be a normal thing to discuss, are somehow mistaken as people who are trying to legitimize what he's done. The first doesn't follow from the second, although there are people who are clearly in the second camp, that is, trying to delegitimize. Now, Alex, to your question, well, several interesting things are happening. Remember when this invasion first was broached as a possibility, you and I were both confident that it wouldn't happen, because we both agreed that it would be an extraordinarily stupid thing for Putin to do. And whatever else he might be, he'd never shown himself to be some reckless gambler, not in Syria, not even, I would say, in 2014, not in Georgia. He's been fairly measured, and yet he did it. And what has struck me after the 2008 reform of the Russian military and the amount of money that has been poured into it, how poor its showing has been, beginning with the northern offensive toward Kiev and by way of Chernihiv, and then the pivot in, I think, April to the Donbass, which has now been the center of operations. Even in Donbass, the movement has been, despite the overwhelming superiority of Russia in just about every category of equipment, especially in artillery, and despite the punishment that Ukrainians absorb, soldiers and civilians, the gains have been fairly slow in coming, and the losses have been very significant. So this, by any measure, couldn't be the way Vladimir Putin expected this war to unfold. I think he underestimated two things. First is the resilience of the Ukrainians, because they are in a position where it's all or nothing. They could literally lose their state. And that gives people an incredible amount of resilience and morale to fight on. The second, I think he didn't foresee, is the coming together of the US and Europe on arms transfers and sanctions. So let's go to the battlefield now. So Kherson, and you know this, but it's the first major city that the Russians took west of the Dnieper, and I think the only one that they have. So if they lose Kherson, it would be a very significant blow. It would also mean that the Ukrainian forces would be positioned possibly to take all of Kherson province, which is very important to the Russians because, among other things, it's not the Crimea, but the water supply to Crimea comes from Kherson. In the meantime, there's another front in the Donbass where the fighting continues. President Zelensky has asked for a mass evacuation, but I don't see Bakhmut having fallen yet, let alone Kramatorsk. So it seems to be a bit of a stalemate. One theory is that the Russians have run aground, that they're exhausted, that they're spent. Another is they're in a regrouping mode and they will throw fresh troops and new equipment into the battle for Donbass and make a play for other parts of Ukraine, such as Zaporozhye province, for example, to try to take all of it. They have already some of it. One final thing. I'm a little puzzled by the reports we get from our intelligence agencies here and from the press, and to the extent that I can follow the Ukrainian press. I don't read Ukrainian, but I can follow it in English through the Kyiv Independent and so on. Yes. On the one hand, we're told the Russians have taken catastrophic losses. The US intelligence services said the other day that was 75,000 killed and wounded. I mean, that would be a massive loss by the standards of any war, 75,000 casualties. And it's usually a 3-to-1 ratio. So for every wounded person, there are 3 casualties. I'm sorry, every dead person, there are three casualties. So on the one hand, they say they've lost all this equipment, they've lost all this manpower, and yet here they are throwing more troops into the Kherson front without, as far as I know, reducing the intensity of fighting in the Donbass. So the question is, where are these men suddenly showing up from? Is the manpower loss not as catastrophic as we think? How do we make sense of this? I don't know the answer to this, but I just kind of maybe throw it back at you to see what your thoughts are.
The answer to that, or at least the answer to that I've heard from one of the key Ukrainian military analysts, his name is Oleg Zhdanov, is that it's not so much an infusion of troops from outside the battle zone as rather a dislocation of the existing troop structure. So the Donbass troops, Russian troops, which outnumbered Ukrainians something like 10-to-1 or 7-to-1, roughly in that range, a large number of them have been moved into southern Zaporizhia. And the troops that were stationed in Zaporizhia have now been transferred across the Dnieper River into the right bank of Kherson province. At the same time, we do know that the Russians are trying to recruit more. They've lowered the draft age. They've also increased the draft age. So there are reports. I've read some reports by Ukrainians saying that a couple of weeks ago they shot down 1 or 2 planes, and the guys who parachuted out of them were over 60 years old. So they're obviously drawing on more than you're.
In other words, our age. That's really pathetic.
That's right. You can imagine what that'll do. And the interesting question that everybody's focused on is the Ukrainians clearly have they've got some momentum on the right bank in Kherson province. And they've been incrementally moving forward in that region. Again, it's nothing spectacular, but just recently, just today, they announced that they had liberated 53 population centers in the last 2 weeks. So slowly but surely, they seem to be drawing in on the city itself. At the same time, the Russians are moving several thousand new troops into this area. The number, I believe, is in the area of about 20,000, 25,000 total for the right bank. And at the same time, the Ukrainians seem to be cutting off the points of retreat, namely the bridges, the railroad bridge, the Antonov Bridge. At some point, they'll start attacking the pontoon bridges, the ferries, and so on. And again, I've heard this from a number of Ukrainian analysts saying that what the Ukrainian General Staff seems to have in mind, again, this is a hypothesis because no one has direct access to their thinking, is to get as many troops into the right bank, shut them off along the Dnipro River, and then just kind of squeeze them from three sides and presumably surround and or annihilate them. Now, if that were to happen, that would be enormous, of course. The question to my mind is, surely, since the Ukrainian analysts are talking about this and writing about this, surely the Russians are quite aware of what the potential for encirclement might be. And yet they're doing this. So does that mean they've got some alternative plan in mind? I haven't heard of any. Or is it perhaps, as you suggested, that Putin plus his general staff are making another of their many mistakes in the expectation that if you bring enough troops and if you bring enough supplies, we'll be able to pull it off regardless of the costs that might entail.
Right. So a couple things. I don't know how the battle for Kherson will turn out. I think you and I have had many discussions about how we're not going to predict future of this war, because it's just been something that has defied a lot of military expectations and even military logic. I don't know a single person who didn't think that the Russians would be in Kiev in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it is. And here we are, and they're at the very least bogged down. But the Battle for Kherson is really critical because the Ukrainians have put substantial numbers of their forces into it. These are battle-hardened, well-trained forces. And if they lose that encounter, it would be a very, very serious blow. On the other hand, if the Russians lose the battle, they'd be able to continue fighting. They have larger manpower resources, but it would be yet another sign that they are in deep trouble. So I think it remains to be seen. You have two groups poised for a major ground battle in Kherson. In some sense, the Ukrainians have the advantage. When you fight on home territory and when you're defending, it's always easier. One of the things that we've seen Russia do very badly is to handle logistics. Napoleon once said an army marches on its stomach, meaning that you've got to feed it, you've got to provide drinking water, you've got to provide petroleum, medicines, etc., tents, etc., etc. If you don't have the capacity to supply your army, it won't fight. And they've had this problem all along. Their supply chain has been disastrous. So one thing to watch really is how effective the supply chain is, or the logistical chain is, and what difference the increasing familiarity that the Ukrainians have with the Russian way of war, plus better weapons from the West, what difference it makes in terms of the Russians being able to sustain that supply chain. Let me just point out one other puzzle, and I'll try to make it in relatively non-technical terms. The cutting edge of any combined arms operation, combined arms simply meaning ground, air, sea, the cutting edge of it, the tip of the spear, is composed of two forces. Mechanized infantry, that is soldiers who are riding in armored personnel carriers or walking on the ground, and tank forces. Those are the leading edge. And those, therefore, are the ones that absorb most of the casualties. And within those two, it's the infantry forces that absorb most of the casualties. So if we say that 75,000 Russian troops have been killed or wounded, that accounts for the overwhelming majority of the numbers they have in their tank battalions and their infantry fighting battalions. So there's some debate going on among experts, and it's unresolved, and I follow it, and I take no position on it. But it's an interesting kind of, not a riddle, but a question that needs to be answered, is if how are they continuing if they've basically been relying on kontraktniki, the contractors, Kadyrovs, sort of gangsters, if you will, and the so-called irregular fighters from the DNR and the LNR, how they managed to sustain this, and will at some point, and this is something that we need to watch for very carefully, will they be forced to do something that Putin has not been willing to do so far, which is to declare mass conscription? That's a huge risk, it seems to me, because once you start conscripting people, you risk the possibility, if the war continues and more Russians die, of demonstrations. And it's one thing to chase away demonstrators from Navalny's group, let's say, but when you have the mothers of soldiers turning up and protesting, are you going to have OMON forces unleashed on the mothers of soldiers? I don't think so. Not without a terrible, I think, blow to the legitimacy of the government. So I think Putin is in a bad way. What I don't understand at this point, and I can throw it back to you, is how this ends. What would be victory for Ukraine? What would constitute some acceptable gain that Putin would say, okay, now I'm prepared to settle? As far as I'm concerned, the minimal conditions acceptable to Ukraine and the minimal conditions I can see Putin accepting are mutually exclusive, which is a recipe for the war continuing on and on.
I agree with you. I mean, it seems to me that if Ukraine were to succeed in pushing back the Russian forces to where they were on February 23rd, to my mind, this would be an enormous victory. I've been asked this question by a number of Ukrainian interviewers, and I've repeatedly said the same thing. I mean, it would be enormous. I mean, for the Ukrainians to be able to pull something like that off would be extremely impressive. Of course, that's not necessarily the way most Ukrainians define victory. For many, that would entail driving the Russian forces from the Donbass and the Crimea. And then there's also a significant segment of the Ukrainian population that believes that the only possible victory would be a victory that entails the destruction of Russia's capacity to launch another war. Because that, of course, is in the back of everybody's minds, regardless of which scenario you prefer. It's the fact that if there's a ceasefire today, or if there's a ceasefire after a Ukrainian victory at Kherson, or whatever the circumstances might be, the bottom line is that as long as the Putin regime remains intact, to a greater or lesser extent, it will continue to exercise its hostility toward Ukraine at some point in the future. So they might stop tomorrow, take a breather for a month or two or a year or two, and then resume hostilities. So if you take the long view, the only way that Ukraine can possibly win this would be for Russia essentially to be demolished, or at least the Russian regime under Putin to be demolished in some significant fashion. But whatever whatever one's preferred scenario, whether it's just a return to February 23rd, whether it's a return to 2013, or whether it's the elimination of the Putin regime in some fashion or other, or at least the weakening of the Putin regime. None of that is obviously acceptable to Putin or to the majority of the Russian elite. It's conceivable that if there were to be a regime change and if there were to be a replacement for Putin, and if this individual were to be less of an authoritarian than Putin, then it's conceivable that this person might want to, well, come to some kind of terms with Ukraine. Although that too isn't quite certain, but be that as it may, as long as Putin is around, I agree with you completely. There's just nothing that he can agree to that the Ukrainians would want. It seems to me that his program minimum would be to retain the territories that he has. I suppose in some kind of, I suppose it's conceivable that he might agree to give up everything short of the entire Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts. But that too would entail a massive withdrawal of Russian forces from a significant portion of Ukraine. And it would be hard to pitch that as a victory. Maybe 3 years down the road, but certainly not immediately. So you're absolutely right. The Ukrainian demands, the Ukrainian expectations contradict those expectations of the Russians. And that, of course, makes it even more what makes things even more complicated is that, when you have Western analysts, or for that matter, Russian or Ukrainian analysts saying there should be, Kissinger recently said this, as did Edward Luttwak in that piece you sent me. There should be a withdrawal of forces, a reestablishment of Ukrainian control, followed by a plebiscite or a referendum that would permit the people, the local inhabitants of these territories to decide where they want to live. Well, all of that presupposes that Ukraine would reestablish control over these territories. So aside from the fact that Russia wouldn't agree to a plebiscite, I'm not sure Ukraine would, but in any case, Russia certainly wouldn't. It certainly won't agree to a withdrawal of Russian forces voluntarily, which leaves us with what? Sort of a continuation of the present for an indefinite period of time. I suppose a lot hinges on the outcome of the battle for Kherson. If the Ukrainians do poorly, they will be in trouble. If the Russians do poorly, they will be in trouble. Who'll be in greater trouble is hard to say, but certainly a victory of some kind could be more or less decisive. And as you can see, I'm hedging my bets by saying more or less decisive. Anyway, back to you, Raj.
Oh, let's think of some possible outcomes based on the continuum that you laid out. But before I get into the continuum, let me make clear, you know this, but I want to make clear to anybody who's listening, it is not for me to tell the Ukrainian government and people what the terms of a peace settlement should be. That is in their hands. But it is incumbent upon you and me to analyze what outcomes could be. So analyzing outcomes is not the same thing as saying, do this. So I'm not President Zelensky's advisor, and I'm certainly not in any position to say to Ukraine, after they've suffered so much, to say, I think you should do this or I think you should do that. Gerhard Schroeder today had a package of concessions that he thought would lead to a peace settlement, but it basically required almost a capitulation on Ukraine's part. So I'm not going to get into that. But let's take the minimal condition, a return to the lines that existed before the February 24th invasion. And it was an invasion, not a special operation. So let's call it what it was. Would that lead to something that Ukraine could say, it isn't completely the victory we want because it doesn't retake all of Lugansk and Donetsk, let alone Crimea, but it essentially puts the Russians where they were before the war, and that by any measure has to be a catastrophic circumstance. If Ukraine were to do that, then I think the United States and Russia would quickly coalesce and say, the war has been won. If the Ukrainians went further and said, well, we don't want to just go back to the lines of February 24th, we want to take all of Lugansk and Donetsk, which is to say, do away with the DNR and LNR, because they're seen as basically Russian instruments for interfering in Ukrainian politics forever. And we also want to take back Crimea. I suspect, and I don't know enough about internal Ukrainian politics to know the effect this would have on Ukraine, but I suspect you would have a split in the West about whether this is too ambitious a goal, because the war would continue, more Ukrainians would die, there would be requirement for more economic and military support from the West. So I could see the French and maybe the Germans and maybe the Spaniards and the Italians, especially given the changes that have occurred in Italy, saying, you know, this is enough. And mind you that Europe is in for a very hard winter. I mean, there was a report today from a major German bank saying the German economy is going to go into recession. They're in big trouble. But if the Ukrainians go even further for reasons that you outlined and say, we don't want to just take back all of Donetsk and Lugansk and Crimea, we want to, in some sense, destroy the Russian army. I have a very hard time seeing rallying around Ukraine to make that possible, even if it were possible, for a whole host of reasons, one of which is the belief that with his back against the wall like that, Russian military doctrine specifically provides for the use of nuclear weapons. Now, we might say, well, Putin is bluffing, he won't do it. But the problem with that is that you have two narratives of Putin. First, he's a paper tiger, he talks a lot, he won't do anything. And the second, he's completely crazy and wants to take over all of Europe. So, you know, we don't know which it is. So I think those are the possibilities I see. And the further you push out from the present to the February 24th lines to taking back all of Donetsk and Lugansk, to destroying the Russian army, the less Western support Ukraine will have. And I think without Western support, it will be losing something extraordinarily valuable. Because for all of the heroism and the military ingenuity that the Ukrainians have shown, Western support has been crucial, especially support in the United States. U.S. support you could maintain, I think, to some degree. It's the European support that I have questions about.
I think you're right. And of course, I mean, Western support has been critical, or will be critical, in the forthcoming battle surrounding Kherson and in the planned Ukrainian counteroffensive. I mean, the Ukrainians are quite explicit that unless they get more weapons, significantly more weapons, they will be in no position to launch a counteroffensive. I mean, they might be able to engage in this kind of incremental movement forward, but they will need significant numbers of more weapons in order for this to translate into something resembling a counteroffensive. You know, in the first and second scenarios that we outlined, let's just disregard the third, because I'm not sure Ukraine is in the position to attack Moscow, even if it wanted to. But in both of those scenarios, but especially in the first one, a withdrawal to February 23rd, what Ukraine will fear most of all is, of course, a resumption of Russian hostilities in the near future. Because the Ukrainians will treat this not as a permanent peace treaty. They will see this as simply a temporary ceasefire that the Russians will utilize in order to launch another attack. So to persuade Ukraine that either of these are viable options, or something in between is a viable option, I mean, the West will need to develop some kind of scheme involving something resembling security guarantees. It can't just be those assurances that were given in the Budapest Memorandum. And again, I'm not sure what that entails, but it will mean that Ukraine will need to have the capacity to be able to defend itself against a future Russian invasion. Now, whether that means joining NATO, whether that means supplying Ukraine with better armaments, who knows? But something along those lines will have to happen for this to be acceptable. Otherwise, the feeling will be, and I think rightly so, that this is just a temporary respite and that the existential battle will resume in a couple of years. And if that's the case, why wait a couple of years? Why not just finish this thing either way today. And there's obviously a logic to that, especially if at that point Ukraine is in some kind of advancing mode. Again, what the solution is, I don't know. I mean, I know many Ukrainians would say NATO membership, regardless of whether NATO would or would not make a difference. I just don't know whether it's realistic to think of membership within the next half year or so, which means essentially that some form of military supply, building up the Ukrainian armed forces to the degree that they can actually sustain and beat back a Russian attack in the future, that might be the only option. But at this point, as you can see, I'm fishing. I just don't know what that would entail. Perhaps you've got some ideas.
Let me talk about NATO for a second, because it is now being applauded here for having supported Ukraine and being steadfast in its corner, and the alliance's stock has really risen. My own view is that NATO did Ukraine a terrible disservice. First, in 2008, at a time when Ukrainians themselves were really divided on NATO membership, President George W. Bush, at the end of his presidency, put Ukrainian membership in NATO on the table. The Europeans weren't keen on doing it, but the United States has a lot of influence within NATO. And so we went to the Declaration of 2008 in Budapest. Is that right? Yeah, Budapest. In which it was said Ukraine and Georgia will not yet be given a membership action plan, but one day they'll be in NATO and so on. 14 years later, even though the crisis over this, now you can say it was a fabrication by Putin, but the crisis over this increased in intensity after the 2014 conflict in Ukraine, the Russian annexation of Crimea and the creation of the statelets. After all of that, NATO was unable to offer Ukraine not only membership, not only full membership, but not even a membership action plan. So what did it do for Ukraine? I mean, let me ask this question, because it's now seen as such a savior. I think it put it in an impossible position. It ratcheted up the tension with Russia, had no intention of coming to its defense once it was attacked, and would not admit it at a time when we know from March 2001 to February 24th, 2022, that the Russians were building up forces, and by the admission of President Biden's own administration, were preparing to attack. So I'm not as high on NATO's handling of this as a lot of people are, maybe even many Ukrainians. So I just will say I have a different point of view, which brings me to another point. So let's assume that the war ends on some terms that are acceptable to Ukraine, and I leave that in the hands of Mr. Zelensky and his government. It's not for Americans to say. I think not even for Ukrainian Americans to say, if I may say so. My view is this. It is completely reasonable for Ukrainians to believe if we settle with Russia now, it's only a question of time before they attempt something like this again. So let me turn that on its head and say, if you look at the military losses, the burning of bridges with the West, the increasing dependence on China while holding a very weak hand, I mean, I think the Chinese have a fair amount of contempt for the Russians. I think you'd agree with that. And given the huge economic costs that they've undergone, it's true that sanctions haven't changed their behavior. It's true that their exports continue, but there's a very interesting graphic in a recent op-ed by Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, who's also a columnist, as you know, for the New York Times, where he shows that Russian imports have completely collapsed because no country wants to sell it anything because they're worried that there'll be sanctions. So there's been a huge cost, right? And the war has shown one thing: if you attack Ukraine, expect to be resisted and expect people to fight back. This is not like the Czechs in 1938 or what have you. So given that, does it necessarily follow that a settlement would mean in a question of time Russia would try this again? Even if the answer is yes, because I don't expect there to be unanimity within NATO to admit Ukraine, I don't think there will be. You come to some solutions such as armed neutrality. Now, what does that mean? It means Ukraine wouldn't join any alliance. Obviously, it wouldn't join a Russian alliance, but it wouldn't also join a NATO alliance, but it would have the freedom to receive training and military supplies from any country it chose. And it is clear that Ukraine, which is what, the largest country in territory aside from Russia in all of Europe, and about the fifth or sixth largest in population. This is a very big country and a highly developed country. If you have a completely revamped Ukrainian military, along with security guarantees, that will be tricky. Would Ukraine be able to deter Russia? Now, I'll say something somewhat controversial here, which might, I don't know if you'll agree, but I'll put it out there. If I were Ukraine, I wouldn't forego the opportunity of developing nuclear weapons. I think it was a mistake in '94 to give up to. I understand all the reasons why they did it, but if you want an ironclad security against Russia, you need security guarantees, a wholly new military force. You don't need fighting experience because Ukraine now has plenty of that. And you might need the hedge of nuclear weapons. The Ukraine that goes nuclear is going to run into great difficulty with the West. But if I were Ukrainian and I would be advising President Zelensky, I would tell him, don't take nuclear weapons off the table anymore. You can't afford to do it.
Raj, that's a fascinating observation. And I suggest that since we've run out of time, we begin our next discussion with this issue of security guarantees, nuclear weapons, and then do a reverse and then focus on battlefield activities in the second part of our talk. But you've raised a bunch of very interesting and very important issues, and I think we'll need a little more time to go into some more detail, and especially regarding nuclear weapons. I think you've touched on a well, again, it's a sensitive issue for everybody, but it's obviously an extremely important one that needs some more discussion. So can we end? I think we can end on that. So I'd like to thank everybody for your participation, and we'll see you again in about a month.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Maria, very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.